The widow across the street asked for help, but the way she looked at me stopped my heart. The day began like any other. I was taking a quiet stroll down the street near my apartment when I noticed movement across the way. A woman struggling with a set of boxes in front of a modest, slightly worn house. She moved with careful precision, but the weight of the boxes was clear in the tension of her shoulders, the slight wobble in her step. Something about her stance made me pause. She wasn't frail, not exactly, but there was a quiet vulnerability that didn't go unnoticed. I felt a tug of curiosity, mixed with hesitation. Should I cross the street? Would it be intrusive to offer help to a stranger? Still, I couldn't stop myself. The moment I stepped closer, she glanced up, and something unexpected happened. Her eyes met mine. For a heartbeat, it wasn't just a passing glance. It was a look that held a subtle intensity, a spark of awareness that made me momentarily forget the boxes she was holding. She was older than me, clearly in her early 40s, yet there was a graceful confidence in the way she carried herself. Her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face softly. I noticed the faint lines around her eyes and mouth, the kind that spoke of experience and resilience, and yet her presence had a warmth that drew me in. Can I help you with those?" I found myself saying, my voice a little rougher than I intended. Her lips curved in a polite smile, and I caught the barest hint of amusement in her eyes. "That would be very kind, thank you," she said, her voice calm, measured, with a subtle musicality that lingered in the air. As I stepped closer, reaching for one of the lighter boxes, our hands brushed, just briefly, just enough to make me notice the warmth of her skin against mine. A simple, accidental touch, yet it sent a quiet ripple through me, an unfamiliar sensation that made my chest tighten pleasantly. I quickly focused on the box in my hands, trying to steady my thoughts, but the glance she gave me as we lifted it together lingered in my mind. I noticed small details, the faint scent of her perfume, a soft, almost imperceptible warmth radiating from her, the careful way she positioned herself to maintain balance. There was a confidence in her movements, even in the struggle, and yet, somehow, she seemed aware of me in a way that went beyond casual neighborly interaction. As we set the boxes down inside her doorway, she straightened and gave me another look. This time, it wasn't just polite acknowledgement, it carried something quieter, more curious, more personal. My pulse quickened, and I felt a strange combination of excitement and caution. The age difference, the social expectations, and my own uncertainty tugged at my mind, but beneath it all, I felt a pull toward her presence I couldn't quite explain. By the time I turned to leave, I realized that something had shifted in the air between us, a delicate, almost imperceptible tension, like the calm before a gentle storm. I didn't know her, and yet I felt a sense of anticipation, as though this small moment was only the beginning of something neither of us fully understood yet. After helping her with the boxes, I found myself lingering on the porch, unsure whether I should say something more or simply retreat back to my own apartment. She stepped inside, then turned back to the doorway, offering me a smile that was both inviting and slightly teasing. It was the kind of smile that made me aware of every heartbeat in my chest. "Thank you again," she said, her voice calm but carrying an almost imperceptible warmth. "Not many people would just stop and help a neighbor these days." I felt my lips twitch into a nervous smile, brushing a hand over the back of my neck. "It's no problem. Really." I glanced at the boxes now neatly stacked inside, their weight gone but the lingering tension from the encounter still present. She tilted her head slightly, a playful spark in her eyes, as if she sensed my hesitation. "You seem careful, though. Not just polite." There was a softness to her observation that made me pause. I didn't know if it was flirtation or just friendly curiosity, but it stirred something unfamiliar inside me. The air between us was quiet, filled only with the soft rustling of leaves outside and the faint hum of the street. I noticed her hand as she rested it on the doorway, the fingers relaxed, yet each movement seemed deliberate. When she shifted, our arms brushed again, subtly this time, enough to make me acutely aware of the warmth radiating from her skin. My pulse picked up, though I forced myself to focus on the ordinary, a box, a step, a smile. You're younger than I expected, she added after a pause, her voice light, almost teasing. But in a good way. I chuckled nervously, caught off guard by the compliment. I get that a lot, I replied, feeling the awkward tension that comes with noticing someone noticing you. There was an honesty in her gaze that made it hard to look away. Her eyes held something I couldn't quite name, curiosity, perhaps, or a quiet invitation to linger a moment longer. We talked for a few minutes longer, exchanging small details about the neighborhood, our routines, the weather. Yet beneath the ordinary words, a subtle connection was forming. Every time our hands brushed, every slight tilt of her head, every faint smile carried weight beyond the casual conversation. It was a quiet intimacy born of shared space and mutual attention. When I finally began to step back, she looked at me again, lingering for just a second too long. Well, I hope I don't make it a habit of asking strangers for help, she said, her lips curling in that same soft, knowing smile. I nodded, feeling an unspoken understanding pass between us. I don't mind, I admitted quietly. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the sensation that this brief encounter had shifted something inside me. The warmth of her hand, the subtle intensity of her gaze, and the soft humor in her voice were imprinted in my mind. I realized that our connection, fleeting though it was, had stirred a curiosity and a quiet longing I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't love, at least not yet, but the first thread had been woven, delicate and tentative, leaving me aware of the possibility of something more. Something that neither of us fully understood, but that promised to grow. Over the next few weeks, our encounters became almost routine, though neither of us acknowledged it aloud. I found myself noticing her more often, whether it was her standing by the mailbox, tidying her garden, or carrying a basket of groceries, and each time, a subtle anticipation settled in my chest. She began to notice me too, often offering a nod, a warm smile, or a light, teasing comment that made my pulse quicken more than it should have. One afternoon, she called across the street. Could you help me with something in the garage? Her voice was calm, almost casual, but the underlying warmth made me step closer without hesitation. As I crossed the street, I observed her carefully. The slight crease of concentration between her brows, the relaxed yet graceful curve of her shoulders, and the gentle sway of her hair as it fell loosely around her face. She moved with purpose, yet there was an elegance to her motions that drew my attention. Inside the garage, she showed me a small project, a shelf she was trying to assemble. I knelt beside her, holding a plank while she measured the space. Our hands brushed frequently, lightly, sometimes unintentionally, and each contact sent a faint shiver through me. There was no urgency, no overt romance, just the quiet, persistent tension of two people aware of one another in a way that went deeper than casual interaction. We laughed at minor frustrations, the board that didn't quite fit, the hammer that slipped, and the sound of her laughter was unexpectedly melodic. I found myself listening to it longer than necessary, savoring the warmth it carried. Each laugh seemed to bridge the gap between us, making the age difference feel less like a barrier and more like a quiet backdrop to a growing connection. When we paused to catch our breath, our shoulders brushed as we reached for the same tool. She didn't pull away, and I noticed the subtle way her hand lingered for just a moment before letting go. That brief contact was enough to anchor the moment in my memory, and I felt a gentle pull toward her presence that was both comforting and confusing. Over time, our small interactions extended beyond tasks. We'd exchange brief conversations at the mailbox, talk about books or movies, or linger on shared observations about the neighborhood. Each time, the emotional layer beneath our words deepened. She would tilt her head slightly, offering an understanding look that made me feel seen, while I noticed the careful attentiveness in her eyes when she listened to me speak. Internally, I struggled with the intensity of my feelings. The age difference, my own uncertainty, and the quiet social norms tugged at my mind, yet the warmth of her presence, the laughter, and the subtle touches made it increasingly difficult to remain detached. It wasn't romantic love yet, but the slow weaving of connection was undeniable. By the end of each encounter, I found myself walking away with a lingering awareness of her, the curve of her smile, the quiet strength in her posture, and the soft warmth of her hand when it brushed mine. Each small interaction, each shared laugh, and each fleeting touch built a pattern of closeness I couldn't ignore. The connection was growing, delicate and patient, like a thread being gently pulled taut between us. It was an unusually warm evening when she invited me to stay for a cup of tea after helping her carry in some garden tools. I hesitated at first. Our interactions had always been light, task-oriented, or punctuated by brief conversations at the mailbox. But the gentle insistence in her eyes made it difficult to decline. Her living room was cozy, filled with soft lamplight, muted colors, and the faint, lingering scent of chamomile and old books. It felt simultaneously familiar and intimate, like stepping into a space that reflected her carefully balanced life. We settled into the living room chairs, and for a moment neither of us spoke. She handed me a steaming cup of tea, our fingers brushing slightly as she did. The contact was brief, but the warmth of her hand lingered, and I felt the familiar stir of awareness in my chest. It was a small, ordinary gesture, yet the intimacy of it hung in the air. "I don't usually have anyone to talk to about these things," she said softly, her voice carrying a vulnerability I hadn't noticed before. She paused, gazing into her cup as if it held the courage to continue. "Sometimes it still feels strange, living alone after so long." I listened carefully, offering only gentle nods and attentive silence, aware that any words might interrupt the delicate flow of her confession. The lines on her face seemed softer in the lamplight, the faint shimmer in her eyes betraying memories of grief and loneliness that she rarely shared. I felt a deep sense of respect and protectiveness rising within me, tempered by the subtle curiosity and connection I couldn't ignore. She continued, sharing stories of her late spouse, small anecdotes, tender memories, and moments of regret. Her voice was measured, yet there were pauses where I could sense the weight of emotions held back, as if she were testing whether she could trust me with the deeper parts of herself. I offered reassurance through presence rather than words, my eyes fixed on hers, my posture open, my hand occasionally brushing the edge of the armrest where hers might rest. At one point, she reached for a cushion, her fingers lingering on mine as she adjusted it. The warmth of her skin, the subtle pressure of her touch, and the steadiness of her movements sent a quiet thrill through me. It wasn't romantic in a conventional sense yet, but it carried an intimacy that neither of us needed to name aloud. There was a rhythm to our conversation, a slow and patient give and take. I noticed the way she would glance up from her stories, meeting my eyes with a subtle hopefulness, as though gauging my reaction. I caught myself mirroring her small gestures, leaning slightly forward, keeping my hands visible, offering the smallest nods of encouragement. The trust between us deepened without any declaration, a quiet understanding forming in shared silence and careful attention. By the time I left that evening, I realized something had shifted. She had allowed herself to be vulnerable with me, and in doing so, had opened a door I didn't want to close. The warmth of her presence, the intimacy of her small gestures, and the trust she'd extended lingered with me long after I crossed the street back to my apartment. For the first time, I sensed that our connection had grown beyond casual neighborly acquaintance. It had become something quietly, profoundly personal. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when circumstances left us alone in her living room. The sun streamed through the lace curtains, casting a gentle, golden glow across the polished wooden floor. We had been organizing her bookshelves together, a task that had started as casual neighborly help but had slowly become a comfortable routine. Today, however, there was something different in the air, a subtle tension neither of us could quite name. She handed me a stack of books, and as I reached to take them, our fingers brushed accidentally. The contact was fleeting, but I felt a jolt of awareness shoot through me. Her hand lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, and the warmth of her touch made my pulse accelerate. I cleared my throat and forced myself to focus on the books, though I could sense her watching me with quiet amusement. There was a moment when we both paused to examine a particularly large volume, standing side by side on the rug. Our knees brushed lightly, almost imperceptibly, but the touch was enough to make the air between us feel charged. I could feel her presence beside me more acutely than ever, the subtle scent of her perfume, the warmth radiating from her shoulder, the gentle sway of her posture as she leaned forward to place a book. It was intimate without being overt, a closeness that neither of us had crossed the threshold to acknowledge. Her eyes met mine briefly, and I caught a softness there that made me acutely aware of the age gap and the hesitations it brought. There was a vulnerability in her gaze, balanced by her usual composed confidence, and I felt a strong desire to protect her while also being drawn inexplicably closer. I noticed the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the tilt of her head inviting unspoken connection, and the subtle way her fingers lingered near mine as she adjusted a stack of books. We continued our task in companionable silence, yet every small gesture, hand brushing hand, shoulders nearly touching, the occasional shared glance, carried weight. Each accidental touch seemed to speak louder than words, creating a rhythm of awareness and anticipation. I could feel the warmth of her presence seeping into my chest, making ordinary actions feel charged with quiet tension. When we finally stepped back to admire the neatly arranged shelves, I realized neither of us moved to break the proximity immediately. She smiled softly, and I noticed a hint of shyness in the way she averted her gaze for a moment before looking back at me. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice carrying a gentle sincerity that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. As I left that day, the memory of her subtle touches, her lingering glances, and the quiet energy between us stayed with me. There was no declaration, no overt romance, just a shared moment that deepened the connection in ways that neither of us had yet fully understood. I walked home with a heightened awareness of her presence in my life, a sense of anticipation for the next time we would be together, and a quiet acknowledgement that something significant was slowly unfolding. The day began like any other, yet by the afternoon, the ordinary routine between us had taken an unexpected turn. She had asked me to help with a small repair in her kitchen, a leaky faucet that had been bothering her for days. The task was simple enough, but as we worked together in the sunlit space, the atmosphere shifted. The sound of running water, the faint smell of soap, and the warm light spilling through the window made the room feel private and almost suspended in time. I handed her a wrench, and as our hands met briefly, she didn't pull away immediately. The warmth of her touch lingered, subtle but insistent, and I felt my chest tighten in a way that surprised me. There was a pause, unspoken yet heavy, in which neither of us moved. The moment stretched, filled with quiet acknowledgement that something more than casual familiarity had begun to take root between us. Then, almost as if rehearsed by circumstance, the faucet slipped from her grasp, splashing water onto the counter. She let out a small gasp, startled, and instinctively reached out toward me. Without thinking, I caught her hands in mine, holding them firmly but gently. Her fingers were warm and soft, and the steady pressure of her palms against mine conveyed both surprise and trust. For a heartbeat, we simply stood there, hands intertwined, the room alive with the quiet electricity of proximity. Her eyes met mine, searching, curious, and perhaps a little vulnerable. I could feel the subtle pulse of her wrist beneath my fingertips, the soft heat of her palms, and the gentle pressure of her body leaning slightly toward mine. There was a fragility to the moment that made my own hesitation impossible to ignore. I wanted to speak, to say something that might define what this was, yet words felt inadequate, unnecessary. The silence itself carried a confession, a revelation of feelings neither of us had admitted, yet both were acutely aware of. She finally pulled back slightly, brushing her wet fingers against her apron, but her glance lingered, soft and unguarded. "Thank you," she murmured, a hint of something unspoken behind the simplicity of the words. Her voice was quiet, intimate, and it left me acutely aware of the growing tension between us. I realized then that the connection we had been nurturing in small interactions, the touches, the glances, the shared laughter, had begun to crystallize into something deeper. It wasn't just friendship or neighborly concern anymore. There was a subtle longing, an unspoken attraction tempered by respect and awareness of the gap between us. When I left that afternoon, the memory of her touch, her warm gaze, and the fragile intensity of the moment lingered with me. I walked home with a sense of anticipation, a careful excitement that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time, it was clear that our bond had shifted. We had crossed an invisible line, not with words, but with quiet, meaningful actions. And in that crossing, the possibility of something profound had begun to take shape. A few days after our subtle revelation in the kitchen, I found myself walking across the street without thinking twice. There was a quiet anticipation in my steps, a mixture of excitement and nervousness that made the familiar path feel unusually significant. She opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been waiting, and greeted me with that same soft, knowing smile that had captivated me from the very first glance. "Come in," she said, her voice gentle, yet carrying a warmth that instantly eased the tension in my chest. The living room felt familiar and comforting, the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the curtains and casting a golden glow over the neatly arranged furniture. There was a quiet intimacy in the space, a sense that the room itself had become a witness to the slow unfolding of our connection. We sat together on the couch, close enough that our knees touched lightly. It was a deliberate closeness, yet it felt natural, unforced. I could feel the warmth radiating from her side, the subtle brush of her hair against my arm as she leaned slightly toward me, and the steady rhythm of her breathing. Every detail, the faint scent of her perfume, the soft hum of the street outside, the muted colors of the room, seemed amplified, heightening the quiet intensity of the moment. She offered her hand, resting it lightly on mine. The touch was gentle but deliberate, conveying both trust and acknowledgement of the unspoken feelings between us. I responded instinctively, holding her hand with a firmness that was reassuring yet tender. For the first time, words felt unnecessary. The warmth of our hands, the subtle pressure of our bodies leaning toward one another, and the lingering glances spoke volumes. We talked quietly, sharing stories of our week, small observations, and fleeting jokes, but beneath the ordinary conversation lay an extraordinary understanding. Every laugh, every smile, every fleeting brush of fingers carried a depth of emotion that had grown over weeks of shared moments. The connection we had nurtured through tasks, conversations, and tender touches now felt complete, like a delicate thread woven tightly into both our lives. When she leaned back slightly, her head resting near my shoulder, I felt a profound sense of calm and warmth. There was no rush, no pressure, just a gentle acknowledgement that we had found something rare, a quiet, deeply rooted connection that was both emotional and intimate, yet perfectly respectful. I realized that our relationship did not need to be defined by society's expectations or constrained by age. It was ours, unique and real, built slowly and carefully, with patience and trust. As I left that evening, stepping back across the street, I felt a lingering warmth that stayed with me long after I returned to my apartment. The subtle touches, the shared laughter, and the quiet glances had culminated in a bond that felt safe, tender, and enduring. For the first time, I understood that what had started as a simple act of neighborly help had blossomed into something profoundly meaningful. And I knew that this connection, delicate, respectful, and deeply human, was only the beginning of a shared journey filled with warmth, understanding, and quiet joy.